All right, so we're all here to enjoy a talk from Professor Donovan Johnson on Martin Buber. And Don Johnson has an MDiv from Trinity Divinity School and studied religion at the University of Tübingen. He received a PhD in literature at the University of California at Irvine and has taught world religions and global humanities in California and Washington State. Like Buber, he developed a dialogue as his mode of instruction. He is an avid hiker, although unlike Buber, his locale is the Cascades of Western United States and not the Dolomites that Buber hiked in. So welcome, Don. We're delighted to have you. You came to visit us right at the very beginning when you were starting this book. And so I'm delighted that this book is now completed. This is the cover of Don's book, Turning to the Other, and Donovan Johnson, a beautiful cover with a photo of Martin Buber as a young man. I believe that he was about 35 when he was writing I Am Thou. So Don preferred that the younger Buber be present on the cover. So welcome, Don.
Thank you, Ado. Thank you for those words. I've got to say that Ado and I go back a ways to soon after she arrived in Olympia. And we were teaching together at South Puget Sound Community College. We taught separate courses, but we also taught world religions together several times. And it was an absolute delight and an opportunity for creativity and growth on my part every time we did it. And I really appreciate that. But we've had a friendship that has continued, and she's always most welcoming if I visit the Zen Center. And I appreciate that so much because I feel totally at home because of that welcome. And so I feel a kinship in our spiritual endeavors, both with Ado and with members of the Zen community that I've come to know at the Olympia Zen Center. So thank you. I want to say a little bit about Buber. Buber might be new to some people, and he was born in Vienna in 1878, so he was 22 at the turn of the century. And he grew up. Vienna, at the time that he was born, was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, which extended across much of Central Europe. And he grew up with his grandparents because his mother left the family precipitously when he was 3 years old. So his grandparents raised him in what is today Ukraine, was an outlying region of the empire at that time. And then he spent time decades in Germany. In 1938, he left Germany because of the Nazis and relocated to Jerusalem at the age of 65. When he got to Jerusalem, he had to learn speaking Hebrew at the age of 65. He was a polyglot. He knew 8 languages and did well with the Hebrew as his language of the street, as well as his scholarly language when he was at the Hebrew University. Before that, when he was in Germany, he was taught at Frankfurt University for 10 years, and he was a specialist in world religions. And I think it's very important to recognize that Buber, his starting point and his focus is Jewish, but he was very conversant, especially with Taoism. And Wu Wei is one of the concepts that we see really informing what he says in I and Thou. And he also was very conversant with Meister Eckhart, a medieval mystic in Germany in the Roman Catholic tradition. And he uses the word Gelassenheit, which means letting go, as another key element of the spirituality he's talking about in I and Thou. I just wanted to mention the breadth of his scope as part of what he brings in his work with spiritual questions. So I want to mention the difference between I, it, and I, thou. He used these two word pairs and said that this is the big distinction. And I, it really has to do with the ego looking for gratification. So the I, it, the I of I, it is the I that uses and experiences. That's the focus of its activity. And this is what I think we might call the monkey mind. And he's very much concerned that that has completely taken over in modern times. And the alternative that he presents is the I of I, thou, which is not the independent, self-absorbed, self-gratifying ego, but it's the I of dialogue, of interaction, of the individual with other human beings, the environment, God. So he really sees that as the opening up to the other. And that's the key in all of this for him, is the concept of turning. Turning means turning from inward focused ego self to the outward focused connection with others, relating to others. And the outward focus means that I never am the other. I can't incorporate the other, but I can reach out to the other. I can open to the other. And then when another person opens to me, reaches out to me with that kind of spirit, then we have mutuality. And so that turning to the other, that reaching out, that opening up, is what Buber sees as what spirituality is all about. So, and that involves participating in being, participating in the transcendent.
Do we have some sound interference, Dawn?
There we go. Okay, does that work?
That's it. That's good.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so we're back and running.
We are. And we are
Okay.
now, we are at the participation then in the dialoguing. You remember where you were?
Yes, I know exactly where I was.
Very good.
Yeah, we're looking at the handout. And I just thought, if we look at the first page of the handout, which really is the foundation for turning, as Buber talks about it.
Right.
And this was as what he did to amplify what he said in I and Thou. He wrote this other document that's called a dialogue. And in this document, he just talks about turning. And if we look at the text, it's in the middle of the first page. And Buber says, the fundamental inner movement of the life of dialogue is one's turning toward the other. And I think turning is a very powerful metaphor for him here, because turning means changing position, changing direction, but it's about turning toward. It's Hinwende, the German even points that, turning towards. And so this turning toward the other means that my focus becomes the other, and an openness that allows the other to impact me. And then he says, if you look at someone, address him, you turn to him, of course, with the body, but also in indispensable measure with the soul. In that you direct your attention to that other person. What is the essential action done with one's essential being? This, that out of the random, incomprehensible, evolve that lies at hand, this one person comes to the fore and becomes present. So I receive the presence of the other person by turning to the other person. And so it's an emergence. And then the world itself seems to change. It's almost like there's a glow that comes with that kind of focus as he sees it. And this turning to the other is fully realized. We come to know the other in the particularity of that other's existence, and even mentally embrace the person so that the other, that the situations common to both the other and myself are experienced from the point of view of the other. I see as the other sees when I let myself be with the other to that degree. And that's turning in its fullness, turning to the other. And he contrasts that with what we have in the shorter paragraph near the bottom. A person withdraws from accepting the other, he says, and then the intercourse between one human world and the other is cut off. And we just sort of turn inward and somehow think everything is comprehensively included inside of me. And he sees that as a real problem of the modern world. So we've got turning to the other on the one hand, that's the I of I, thou. And then we have this turning inward, or bending over backwards, is one of the phrases he uses. This turning towards oneself instead of toward the other, or turning towards one's inner self, which is an illusion as he sees it. This turning inward just turns the other into an it. I no longer treat the other person as a presence, but as a means to my own ends, to my own gratifications. So that's the contrast that he sets up very clearly in this passage. And then I included different places in the course of his writing where he talks about turning in different contexts, so we can sort of see how it works out over time. And what I'm thinking to do is to shift over to the third page of the handout, item number 6. And this is a very dense passage from I and thou. Maybe I should see if there are questions in the meantime before we proceed to look at sort of an extension of this. The overall concept is what I've tried to lay out so far, of turning to the other as opposed to turning inward to oneself, to the ego self. Does that make sense? Is it a useful construct to think about?
Well, yes, Don, hello.
Hi, Dico.
Hi. What came to mind for me was the Buddhist concept of turning around. I've heard that spoken of during training, and I believe that G.U. Kennett spoke about that an incident in her training where she was leaving the monastery and she turned around and went back into training. She was going to run away and she turned around. And she's often spoke of this as a spiritual process, this turning around so that you have a different perspective. So I think that relates very closely with Buddhist concepts.
That's great. And it seems like in the example that you talk about, the turning around involves a kind of surprise, right? It wasn't planned. it was an event that had its own surprises, its own path that she couldn't foresee.
Exactly.
That's beautiful, beautiful story. Yeah. Yeah. Well, perhaps we should go on and look at this passage from Ayandao. This comes from later in Ayandao, and it's where Buber is explaining some of the dynamics of this relationship between the I of I and thou and the I of I it. And so he starts out, I'm going to read it and make comments as we go along. The I of the one who steps out of the relational event. And of course, the one in the relational event is the I of I and thou. So that's the I of relatedness, of spiritual expression. A person steps out of that into separation and the self-awareness of separation, but does not lose the reality of the I of I and thou. So we can go back and forth between these. And he says we go back and forth all the time. So that's part of what we do in our development. But the I of the I and thou is still there, even if we slip into the monkey mind ego self. And then he says, its participating remains buried within. This is the participating of the I of I and thou. Remains buried within, preserved as a living potentiality. So it's like the seed is buried, and he uses this quotation, the seed remains in her. So in the person has the seed, which is the I of I thou, and it continues. And then in this state, this is the realm of subjectivity, in which the I is aware at once both of its bond and connection, that's the I of I and thou, and of its separateness, that is the I of I it. Authentic subjectivity can only be understood dynamically as the striving of the I and its only truth. The I strives between these two poles, you might say. This is the place where the desire for ever higher, more unconditional relation and for full participation in being arises and is heightened. So this is the desire that is to let the seed fully develop in the person, the seed of the I thou that is sometimes buried, but then can develop and blossom. In subjectivity, the spiritual substance of the person comes to maturity. And that's this subjectivity of living in this contest, you might say, between I thou and I it. The person becomes conscious of herself as participating in being, a participant, as a being with, sharing being, and as being, pure being. So these are elements or dimensions of the self-awareness that we mature into as we move from the I of I it to the I of I thou. So that's my reading of this little passage, which I think shows some of the dynamics that might be relevant in a Zen context. I'm not sure, but I'd be curious to hear people's responses to that. And that's really, I think, sort of a kickoff for conversation. So we talked about Buber, his life, his perspectives to some degree, and we talked about his concept of turning, and we've looked at a particular passage in I and Thou that seems to me to be evocative for reflection.
Hi, Don. Thanks
Hi.
for being here with us tonight. You mentioned the I I and it and I and thou as being poles, P-O-L-E-S,
Mhm.
and this movement between the two. And I'm wondering if you could say more about that, because it seems, well, I don't know. It just strikes me as being, I guess my thinking is, does the I and that, if the I and thou is always present, is the movement between poles, or is it almost like an in and an out?
Mhm.
Anyway, I'll stop there.
Yeah. Well, I think, and Buber talks about this. He says that there are people who are totally live in the I-it world, and they just see everything as a transaction, and it's all about, in a sense, buying and selling, right? It's all that kind of transactional stuff that isn't really being present to the other. It's using the other, or for one's own purposes. So everything that other person says is a means to my end. In other words, it's fodder for my argument if it's, if I want to argue, right? But polarity then is that is something that we sort of becomes an aggregate in our own lives as we develop as human beings. And then I and thou becomes a possibility because there's an internal thou, as he says it, that we're born with, but that we don't, it doesn't germinate unless we make a turn of some kind toward the spiritual reality. And so he says that a lot of development as a spiritual being is this going back and forth because we slip into using other people, self-gratification as a goal and a focus, and then we can turn again and open up to presence. So it's really presence versus kind of selfish purpose, I guess, would be another way of talking about it. You could say a polarity of presence and selfish purpose or ego purpose. So that maybe that makes more sense out of polarity. I kind of threw that out as, I think that's my own term. But he's talking about what he calls in German schwingen, which can mean kind of wrestling or struggling back and forth between these two. But it's an ongoing thing we work with.
So in our studies, Don, Hee-Jin Kim is someone we have studied, and he refers to it as a negotiation. The continual negotiation we make between the absolute world and the relative world, that we go back and forth, and that the absolute is inbuilt in us, and yet we are in the relative world most of our time, and yet we are negotiating continually to balance ourselves, to be able to transact, as it were, between those states of being.
And we live in both at once.
Right.
Yeah, and yet if we can shut off to the one or be open to both, right?
Yeah.
So that's helpful. The absolute and the relative become, I mean, that's Buber's language as well in many of his discussions of this. Yeah.
It's just the word negotiation was always helpful to me, simply that it didn't negate anything at all. It meant how the ways in which we managed to go back and forth to be able to be present and aware of what state we are in or what world we are in at any given moment. So.
Self-awareness. I mean, I think this passage invites us to self-awareness. It says that's means we're on the path to maturity, right?
Yeah. So Jerry, you're there somewhere, aren't you? You asked that question last week about if one has an awakening experience, what happens to bodhicitta? Maybe you could raise that question again and unmute yourself to talk, please.
There, got it. I really don't know that I can be helpful here, Edo-san.
You asked that excellent question last time about, it's the question I want you to ask, not whether I want you to answer it.
Well, I can try to. I'm not sure that it's so well posed. There was a question in the essay by Aguian Inoue on his commentaries, in which I don't understand well. I have not, over the years, understood well Nagarjuna's statement of that looking into the knowing fully knowing the transiency was at the root of Buddhism, of enlightenment. And I didn't in the past really connect it with death, although in my own case, I became fixated on my death, and I think a good deal of my studies was to try to beat death in some way, which would fit into Nagarjuna's statement. So death is usually spoken of in a negative way, but it may be that Nagarjuna is really saying, knowing that all things pass, not just personal, but all things. Everything dies, if you will, or changes, if you prefer. So so first of all, I don't understand what his meaning is, and then in the commentary, often Buddha mind is used, or Buddha bodhicitta is used, and I haven't really in my own mind clarified what is Buddha mind, what is bodhicitta. Is Nagarjuna speaking about bodhicitta, the way-seeking mind, or is that for him and for us equivalent to enlightenment, if you will, to the Buddha mind, to seeing or being in the midst of the morning star, which would correspond to the I and thou in a very direct way, and not so much in a philosophical discussion, but in the actual interaction between two people. So I'm not quite sure what the question is that maybe you formulated better than I have.
So your question was, as bodhicitta is the seed, which Buber is talking about here, the seed remains in her, so that bodhicitta seed remains. And the question was, does that seed transform into enlightenment? Or are these two different things? Is the awakening experience something else, not terribly different, but does the seed continue for the purpose of that constant, continual desire to know and to experience awakening?
Yes, and
Buber is alluding to this here when he says the seed remains in her. This is the realm of subjectivity. Well, he says it preserved as a living potentiality, that the seed is the living potentiality.
Well, and is the bodhicitta that the potentiality, or is it
correct?
Is it effectively equivalent to enlightenment itself? Is there any way? I mean, certainly the experience is somewhat different, but is that a mistake to separate the two?
So Don, what do you say about that from Buber's standpoint, and just as a point of discussion about the notion of the seed as remaining in us and the importance of that for potentiality?
Well, I think it's absolutely important to Buber that there's a seed, or even to use another word that Eckhart uses, spark, in order for anything to happen. I mean, you can't move toward enlightenment or fully realize presence, which is what Buber would talk about, I think, without having some innate seed or power that you move with to release it. So I don't see it as separate things, quite like Jerry's talking about. I don't think it's that whole notion of unfolding, of coming to full form. It's which Buber talks a lot about realization in some of his early writing, and he's talking about this realizing or coming to full form. What is there just in seed, and I think the beginning of a spiritual path is the germination of that seed. So it's all together for Buber. It's all part of the nature of unfolding and growth.
And well, I also think that sometimes when we talk about things, they appear as a separation, and yet it is one indwelling in us, and that these cannot truly be separated in us. In that sense, we might pull them apart to be able to talk about them, but they are not truly separate things.
But we can willfully or even unconsciously become blind to that seed.
This is true. Yes.
That's the other part of it. Yeah.
Yes. Yes. Maybe there are some other questions.
I have a question. Don, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Larry. Yeah.
Previously, you referred to the relative and the absolute. And I wonder if it's safe to say that Buber acknowledges the relative in I-it, the ego-centered monkey mind of how we perceive the world and our relationship to others. He sees that tension, acknowledges that tension, and yet the fundamental premise of I, thou is more absolute, beyond dualistic thinking, recognizing that there is no isolated I that exists separate from our relationship with others, and in reaching out to others, attempting to go beyond our dualistic thinking. Is that oversimplifying it?
I think that's a good deal of it. It's he talks about aligning with the absolute. He says, in a sense, become what you are by, in a sense, surrender to that reality, that bigger reality, the absolute. He also used the word the unconditional to talk about that, which is interesting. But he really does not want to give in to the idea that everything is one. He's not a monist, right? He's very, very clear about that. So to be in a dialogical relationship means that I never become you, but I can be open to you so that the interaction between us actually shapes what I become. but he's always wants to say the other is other. There's the otherness of the other is something he won't let go of, because then he just feels like everything will collapse into a monism, and then you have no dialogue. And he's not going to give up. I mean, dialogue is the core insight for Buber.
And yet there is, in that activity, there is a certain degree of self-surrender to go beyond the small self.
Absolutely right. And it's certainly somehow getting past the ego self is, we have to turn from that self to the openness. And he talks about, at one point talks about a walking stick, and he's tired at the end of a hike, and he gets down, it's twilight, and he comes to an oak tree, and he takes his walking stick and he takes it out and pokes it at the oak tree. And for that moment, he feels connected to the oak tree, but at the same time, he feels the reality of himself as an entity, and he's feeling both at once, and the stick becomes the connection. But he and the oak tree don't become one. And that's what Buber wants to absolutely maintain.
Okay, so it's important to maintain the distinction.
Yeah, and then the walking stick then becomes the metaphor for what he talks about elsewhere is the between. And he says that the between is more real than the subject and the object.
Oh.
Because subject and object puts you in the it world. He's really firm on that. But the between, the walking stick, becomes really important. And there's a way that I believe in Buber that when he's talking about two people really addressing each other as thou, there's a oneness there that he acknowledges, but they're still separate. And I like to say it with hyphens, the two and the one at the same time. I think that's where he is, but not everyone would agree with that, because he's so busy saying we're not just swallowed up in a universal self that is ourselves. I mean, that's part of he would say that's part of the I. That's the it side of things.
Thank you.
Okay.
That helps me. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you have to sort of work with it for a while till the pieces start fitting together with Buber.
Don, when before we started, I understood you and Steve were having a conversation about the difficulty of dialogue with the other in these hot political times. And as you describe the dialogical relationship of I never become you, but I can be open to you, which has an influence on who I am. It seems like that requires people to risk giving up who they are, who they think they are, to be influenced in that dialogical relationship. And so if I see having a relationship with you as somehow giving up some part of who I am, then maybe I don't want to dialogue with you, because I'm pretty concrete around who I am. And it seems like that would just be such an awful cycle to get stuck in.
Yeah, well, on the one hand, he's very definite about the concreteness. The concreteness is important because I address you as the concrete person that you are. You're a person that has certain qualities, and it's not the qualities, but you, with the constellation of all these qualities, are addressing me with a constellation of my qualities. And so the concreteness of you is what I want to be open to. But then the concreteness that I imagine for myself becomes secondary in that turning to openness. And if I have an agenda, if I have things about myself that I want to focus on, I'm not open to you. So there's a kind of, you said risk, and I think that's really, really important. And Buber is talking about risk all the time. There's risk, and he says a lot of people don't want that risk. They think it's dangerous or foolish or whatever, and they're missing presence because they won't be open. So you're evoking this response as a way for us to really connect on this openness that Buber invites us to.
So in this, somebody else wants to go first, but in this number 5, the holistic nature of turning as transformation, he writes, or maybe you are writing here, the process of transforming our inner lives must be expressed in the transformation of our outer life, of the life of the individual as well as that of the community. Could you speak to what that means, Don?
Okay. Buber developed this concept of Hebrew humanism, and he's really, he was involved in the early stages of Zionism around the turn of the 1900s. And the Zionists were very focused on a physical land and state. Reclaiming the Jewish homeland. And Buber was 100% for that, but his focus was the cultural and spiritual dimension. And for Herzl, for example, his mentor, Herzl was focused on the political dimension. And Buber here is saying, we need the political and social dimension, but we need the inner and spiritual dimension together because it's a holistic, total package. And so he's arguing for that. He calls it Hebrew humanism, and he elsewhere compares it to the Renaissance humanism of the Italians. Mm-hmm. The recapturing of the glories of the heritage of the past.
I see. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
So he's looking at it, the holistic, both inner and outer. And, so much of the time, I think we focus on the inner because of our inclinations, but he's saying the outer is equally important.
Okay.
And that will happen if we're true to the openness that he invites us to.
Okay, thank you.
Edo-san?
Yes.
I do have a question. It's different than the one that you asked me to pose.
That's fine. No, but it's to Don. The question is to Don. Yeah.
Yes, it's a question to Don.
Yeah.
Okay, Jerry.
In this question of I and thou, we're speaking about something which also appears in, I don't say also appears in Buddhism, but when the other is perceived as almost being able to use you as a medium to speak, it's very direct. And this kind of thing is something, or bodhicitta or bodhi, is something that I've, in the last several years, asked some rabbis about, because I was really interested in my own tradition, which is Jewish, and wanted to know what are the classical commentaries. I mean, the Jewish tradition is very rich and very highly elaborated, and certainly Christianity has a body of discussion of these kinds of things, the so-called mystics. I think that's a terrible word. There's nothing more direct. So I asked the rabbis, well, where in the classical Jewish commentaries is there discussion of this? And none of them was able to point to any. They didn't know of any. One of them pointed toward the Kabbalah. Well, maybe so, but that's not the traditional Jewish commentaries, and yet the subject is something of universal human experience. So it's very hard for me to think that the traditional Jewish commentaries don't discuss this stuff. Can you point to any traditional Jewish commentaries that do?
Okay, now exactly what stuff?
Say the essence of I and thou, of directly appreciating someone else or other things.
I think Buber gets it from the Hasidic movement, and this is very central for him. He spent an enormous amount of effort translating the Hebrew scriptures on the one hand. He spent decades doing that. He spent more time working with the tales of the Hasidim of Central Europe.
Well,
And this, yeah, but the Hasidim talk about the Tzaddik is the spiritual leader in a Hasidic community, and the spiritual leader conveys spiritual insight to his followers, and this becomes, I think, the prototype for Buber of community.
that seems true to me. That nevertheless, you have this enormous body of Jewish commentary on the Torah, on the Talmud, the various Mishnahs, and on and on and on. A very humane and respectable tradition, and as you say, he may get it from the Hasidim, who by the way point to the Kabbalah.
Right.
Is that the only place? Is this basic human experience? Because it is a basic human experience, which if not all people experience overtly, is part of their psyche, and quite some appreciable percentage of people must experience this on their own, because it's just a basic human condition. It's part of the basic human condition, and the Jewish tradition being so rich and so extensive, one would think that that this business is addressed directly somewhere. And no one's been, and yet I haven't had any guidance as to where that may be.
Okay, in the book of Deuteronomy, it talks about loving your neighbor as yourself.
Yes, that's also in Leviticus 19.
I'm sorry?
It's also in Leviticus 19.
Okay, right, Leviticus 19 as well. But Buber takes that and he talks about the neighbor. Who is my neighbor? And he's saying, my neighbor is anyone I come across. And so he's doing an interpretation of that as the occasion for I and thou. So he connects it with that. And I'm sure there's a lot of commentary on those parts of the Torah. And by the way, one of the things he does, he says Torah is just the Hebrew word for teaching. It's not law. It's not lex. It's not the Roman Greek concept of law. It's teaching or instruction. And he's really, really firm on that. It's not law as he sees it. He doesn't, and Buber had an ongoing dialogue with a person who became his best friend, and that's Rosenzweig, Franz Rosenzweig. And these were the two greatest German Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century. And they had this ongoing dialogue where Rosenzweig was moving more and more towards observance of the law, and Buber stood outside of that, stood apart a bit, and he was more focused on Agadah, which is the lore, the teachings of the stories, rather than the commandments. So we have that tension right there in Buber's own life as part of his dialogue with his friend.
I know nothing about this stuff, but the first thing that popped into my head, Jerry, was Moses talking to God and God talking to Moses. And the dialogue that, yes, okay, I know that much. And that dialogue transformed an entire people, and that Moses's resistance to hearing God. I mean, to me, that's such a key dialogical moment in that text. So that's just what popped into my mind.
Yes, I think I agree.
Yeah, and it's interesting because Moses' resistance is part of the dialogue. I mean, he's open and yet he's hesitant, I guess I would say, because he does go follow through. He takes the role that he is called to in the story, right?
So Don, I have a question. Can you? You had mentioned that Buber was familiar with Wu Wei, the Taoist concept.
Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah. In 1910, he published an interpretation, actually a collection of Chinese spiritual texts. I mean, he was ahead of his time doing this kind of thing. He was a globalist in that sense, right? In 1910, it's pretty early for Chinese studies. But he knew somebody that could help him with some of the language issues. But he was very interested in the Tao. And so he wrote this book, this commentary at the end of the collection called The Teaching of the Tao. And it's like 20 pages if, as a Word document. And he's interpreting the Tao. And he does this, he is setting up basically his view of global spirituality. And so he's got the Tao, he's got the Buddha, and he's got Jesus. And he puts these up as three masters representing three traditions around the world. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is the representative of Judaism for Buber. Mm. So I don't know, am I still on point here?
Well, I guess I would be interested to know how he interprets the idea of Wu Wei with his notion of I and thou.
Okay, and that's an interesting thing. In I and thou, he's talking about active versus the translator translates it passive, but he says I think he's really talking about receptive, active versus receptive. And he's saying that receptivity is part of being whole, of being wholly open, of living in the I-thou realm. And that receptivity looks like inactivity. This is coming straight from the Tao Te Ching, right? So what appears to be inactivity is strength. And that's where he's really tapping into Wu Wei when he's talking that way. And in the index to my book, I've got many pages on Wu Wei that you can look at. But I mean, it resonates all through, I think, because he's talking about this openness that isn't just maintaining my program or my intentions, my goal, my plan for the conversation, right, or for the ongoing dialogue.
Thank you.
Can you talk about the turning toward the particularity of the other? I was approaching this from the way I understand the relative and the absolute, and a bunch of other things. So I'm not sure if this is going to make sense, but I'll go ahead and start. I was thinking when I fully attend to you, I recognize our essential nature or presence that's manifested in your particular form and experience. When I turn toward you completely, I forget in that moment, I forget myself. It's as if, you know, it just drops away. But it was interesting to me when you said on the first page of your handout, in the, looks like at the second paragraph, towards the end, it says, every particular thou is a glimpse through to the eternal thou. And it's like we approach the absolute through the particular, through turning toward that which is in front of us completely. And I was wondering if you could speak about that.
Late in his life, he had a visitor in Jerusalem who was a Zen practitioner who somebody wanted them to say that they both had the same ideas, and he could affirm that it was presence that was what was important in that moment, which I think is interesting. The account, I've got to think about it for a while, but he's absolutely sure that Zen is focused on the particular, and it's the transcendent in the particular that Buber is interested in. And I think that's what he found that resonated for him with Zen.
Okay.
But the particular, if you don't have a particular, then you have your own conception of the person. You're not addressing the person as such. And I think that's the difference for Buber that's absolutely important, is the concreteness of the other person. And if I just look at you in terms of a few of the qualities of you that I can perceive, that's not openness to you in terms of your spirit, your intentionality, all that you bring to the moment of our encounter.
Okay. Well, and that would require a mutuality. That would require me being open to you. I don't know. Am I on the right track here?
Well, I think mutuality is when something, it becomes really fully realized, it comes to full flowering.
Okay.
When the mutuality is primal. He talks about primal mutuality, which I think is a beautiful phrase. The primal mutuality is we both flourish in that. And he talks about how we confirm each other, and he says it is from one person to the other in this mutuality, that the bread of self, and he's talking about the I thou self, the bread of self is passed from one to the other in the mutual confirmation that we come to in dialogue.
Can one have an I thou relationship that is not reciprocated with a human being?
You know, he says, I don't know how he would answer that exactly, but he talks about, and one of the little snippets I sent in the handout talks about trust as being absolutely important for dialogue to take place. And I think with trust, if the trust is mutual, you have the potential for the reciprocity that we're talking about. But you know, he talks about his cat in I and Thou, and he talks about a horse another place, and he talks about trees at numerous places. He even talks about a piece of mica at one point in his writings. And he's talking about an I thou relationship outside of the interhuman. And it's being fully present to that. And he even distinguishes early in I and Thou, he distinguishes between seeing the tree as an object and being present to the tree. And he's not talking about, you know, dryads or something mystical. He's talking about the present reality of the tree. But I think that's a really good question. I need to think about it some more, about the mutuality or lack of mutuality, the one-sided openness.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, I think a one-sided openness could be transformative, but then again, that's taking risks because you have no idea whether the other person is going to be able to rise, to actually turn in that moment of encounter, or even semi-encounter. Yeah.
Yeah, I've just asked that in connection with the state of the world right now and how we approach other people who can't we don't be communicating, and having that kind of openness to the presence of the other, which is taking a risk. You don't know what's going to happen, but there's still something there, it seems, at least in that effort of opening to the.
It just seems like the number of impossible dialogical conversations has multiplied in the last years. And it just seems like, we're looking at what seems like totally impossible. But he says that without trust, it's not going to go anywhere. And that would be mutual trust. And that's part of the state of things we're in.
Okay, my friends, how are we doing? If we could let maybe just one more question, if anybody has one more question, and maybe not, it depends. If one more question wants to come forward.
I have one more question if nobody else does.
Okay, all right, Larry.
Going back to section 5, Don.
Yeah.
Return means reestablishing the original foundation to which we want to return with the material of a fundamentally different world of humankind. What is that original foundation? Could you help me understand, please?
Well, okay, this is in the context of an article called Hebrew Humanism. And he is using this as an analogy, a parallel to Italian Renaissance humanism. He lived in Italy for a year when he was like in his late 20s. And his Italian was better than his English, by the way. But he sees the need for a reclaiming of the Hebrew heritage, and that's what he's celebrating in this paragraph and elsewhere, especially this article. And he's saying we can't simply replicate or return to the past. So we have to take the past and address it in the context of the present.
Mm-hmm.
It might be, I don't know, maybe comparable to how do people practice Zen in the United States, right? Crossing from one cultural area to another. It means creativity, invention, grit, and risk taking. I mean, those things would come with that. And there's the rabbis that interpret the Hebrew scriptures interpret for the present. Jonathan Sack, he's the sort of the rabbi of England, and he writes these wonderful reinterpretations of the ancient biblical stories of the patriarchs and their families and all that. And he's showing how reconciliation is the core value in these stories. But that's reading it from the need of the moment today, not reading it from the moment of its origin. Jewish interpretation and commentary is not originalist like the right-wing interpreters of the Constitution in the United States. Not at all. And I think Buber is really clear in this passage that he's saying, we're not going to go back and reconstruct what was. We're going to take the heritage and its inspiration and learn how to live in the present with that heritage as informing who we are.
A foundation of fundamental human values that are always relevant.
There we go. Yeah. And I think he wants to affirm that foundation, but the foundation goes much deeper than a historical moment.
Thank you.
Okay, my friends. All right. Thank you. Don, congratulations on the publication of your book.
All right.
Buddy.
All right. Yes.
But it's a beautiful book. It's very readable. And I don't even think that it's a book that needs to be read exactly from, front to finish. I have opened it up and read various topics within and found it very valuable. So deep appreciation, Dawn, for being with us tonight and for, all of your abiding knowledge and, lifelong tenacity and so forth in publishing this book and putting it forward. So I really am grateful to you for doing so.
Well, your support in this process over the last 8 years has been a real pillar for my work in this project. So thank you, Ado.
Yeah,
and
I also wanted to say that the painting that is sitting over Don's left shoulder was painted by Allyson. So
yeah, it's hard to see it.
No, we can see it. We've been able to see it the whole time.
Okay, that's good. Okay.
No, it's there.
I just have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation tonight. I feel like I know where to go when I need true dialogue partners
Okay.
It's right here. Thank you.
I think so. I think so. Yeah. So.
Yes. Yes.
All right. Please, everybody out there, stay careful, stay safe, stay well. And we will continue. You know, we are in dialogue every Wednesday. And so we are reading a book that has sometimes some similar concerns that Martin Buber had. And so that's why the question came up. Turning is certainly very deep in Dogen Zenji's teachings also. So we come across these similarities now and then, and with deep appreciation for them. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And so we look forward to seeing you again. Is there a new book coming forward? Or not quite yet? A new book, Don?
Oh, a new book from me?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm still deeply playing with Buber with my blog, which is a one way to sort of dip into Buber a little bit here and there. You talked about dipping into the book, but the blog is another way to dip in once in a while.
Please say what the name of that blog is so people could find you.
It's called Trekking with Buber, and it's on the handout, the address of it.
Okay.
And it's hard to find through Google, but it's on the handout.
Okay. All right.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, my friend. All right. Well, take care. Thank you very much. Thank you for everything. We just ring a bell to finish, so it sort of bookends the, being together. Thank you, Don. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Ado. Yep.
Thank you.
Right. Be well, be safe, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
All right.